Do you know why some souls break later than others? Jung believed there was a reason that does not appear in the beginning, but only in the final stage of an empath's awakening. A stage he hinted at, but never named directly. A stage so unsettling, so transformative, so deeply psychological, that even the unconscious fears it. Some call it liberation, some call it rebirth. Jung would have called it the moment the empath becomes dangerous, because there is a final stage, a last threshold, a point where the empath stops being the wounded one and becomes something the world is not prepared to face. But here's what most people never realize: this transformation doesn't happen with light. It happens with shadow. It happens when everything you thought you knew about yourself collapses in a single, quiet moment of truth. And this is where the story darkens. Because before an empath reaches the final stage, they spend years in emotional gravity wells. They carry pain that isn't theirs. They absorb storms they did not cause. They soften themselves just to make others feel lighter. They become the emotional anchor in rooms filled with chaos. They become the listener, the healer, the counselor, the safe one, the one everyone turns to, but no one protects. And for a long time, the empath believes this is who they are: soft, gentle, forgiving, understanding, endlessly available. They believe this is destiny. But Jung discovered something unsettling about destiny. Often, destiny hides inside the shadow of what we fear becoming. The empath's shadow is not cruelty. It is power. Silent power. Spiritual power. The power of seeing too much. Feeling too deeply. Knowing without being told. Most people never realize what happens next, because this power sleeps for years. Sometimes decades. Sometimes an entire lifetime. But then one day, without warning, it wakes. That's the moment everything begins to flip. The moment the empath stops absorbing the world and starts confronting it. But before that awakening, there is a breaking. The breaking is always quiet. It comes after too much giving, too much loyalty, too much hope, too much emotional labor, too much sacrificing pieces of the self just to keep someone else comfortable. And the empath reaches a point where something inside whispers no more. Not as anger, not as revenge, not as rebellion, as truth, a soft truth, a steady truth, a dangerous truth. This truth is the beginning of the final stage. But here's the part most empaths never expect. The final stage does not feel empowering at first. It feels like death. A psychological death, a spiritual disintegration. Something inside you collapses: the old identity, the old story, the old version of yourself that survived by bending, forgiving, softening, shrinking. This collapse is the most terrifying moment an empath will ever face, because it feels like losing yourself. But here's what Jung found that very few understand: you are not losing yourself. You are losing the version of you that others created. You are losing the false roles, the survival masks, the emotional armor made of gentleness, the invisible chains of empathy without boundaries. You are losing the self that was never truly yours. And this is where your shadow steps forward. Not to harm you, not to punish you, not to darken you, but to complete you. Jung taught that wholeness comes from embracing the shadow, the parts of yourself you were taught to reject. Your intuition, your clarity, your intuition that was ignored, your anger that was silenced, your truth that was buried, your instincts that were dismissed, your knowing that was called too much. And now these parts rise, quietly, naturally, inevitably. This emergence feels dangerous because it is not dangerous to you, dangerous to anyone who benefited from your silence. And here's where the suspense begins. Because the empath's final stage is not healing. It is not forgiveness. It is not acceptance. The final stage is transformation, a transformation that changes the entire landscape of the psyche, a transformation that alters the empath's emotional gravity, a transformation that flips attraction, karma, patterns, instinct, destiny. This transformation begins with one simple realization: I cannot go back to who I was. Once this thought appears, you cannot unthink it. You cannot repress it. You cannot outrun it. It is the moment the unconscious becomes conscious, and once consciousness awakens, the old self dies instantly. This is also the moment the empath becomes one of Jung's chosen archetypes, the soul, called to walk into its own shadow without fear. But here's what nearly no one understands. The empath's final stage is not becoming cold. It is becoming clear. Clarity is more dangerous than anger. Clarity is more threatening than rage. Clarity is what dismantles manipulation. Clarity is what breaks toxic cycles. Clarity is what flips the power dynamic instantly. Because once an empath sees clearly, they stop negotiating with illusions. They stop explaining their worth. They stop carrying emotional dead weight. They stop sacrificing themselves for people who feed on their softness. They stop being emotionally accessible to those who only take. And in that moment, everything shifts. The empath enters the final stage, the stage Jung would have called individuation through shadow. This is not healing the wound. This is owning the wound, integrating it, becoming sovereign through it. But let's slow down, because to understand this final stage, you must understand the three psychological transformations that led to it. The first transformation is awakening. The second is release. The third is embodiment. Awakening begins when the empath realizes the emotional contract they never signed, the silent agreement where others receive, and they give, where others hurt, and they heal, where others demand, and they adapt. Awakening is sudden. It feels like seeing your life through new eyes. It feels like remembering a truth you forgot long ago. It feels like the moment your unconscious whispers, "You were never meant to be this small." Most people never realize what happens next. Release comes next. Release feels like emotional detachment. Not coldness, just neutrality. You no longer react the same way. You no longer absorb the same way. You no longer feel pulled by the same people. This neutrality scares others, because they can feel you slipping out of their emotional grasp. But the final transformation, embodiment, is the most dangerous. Embodiment is when the empath steps into the version of themselves that was always waiting beneath the wounds. Embodiment is when you become both light and shadow, soft and sharp, compassionate and discerning, kind and untouchable. Embodiment is when you carry your pain with wisdom, not with apology. And this stage's final stage changes everything. People feel it instantly. They feel something in you they cannot manipulate, something they cannot confuse, something they cannot distort, something they cannot use. They feel the empath becoming whole. And a whole empath is a dangerous empath, because a whole empath is no longer controlled by guilt, no longer driven by trauma, no longer shaped by seeking approval, no longer tricked by emotional bait, no longer tied to old patterns. A whole empath sees beyond words, beyond intentions, beyond masks. A whole empath sees the truth at the center of people. And this sight-thigh's psychic clarity is what makes them one of Jung's chosen souls. But here's where the shadow twist enters. As the empath steps into embodiment, they begin to unlock a form of intuition that feels almost supernatural. The intuition that was buried under years of absorbing pain. The intuition that now speaks without hesitation. The intuition that guides them with precision instead of fear. This intuition becomes their compass. And with this compass, the empath begins to navigate life differently. They stop chasing connections. They stop explaining themselves. They stop compromising their truth. They stop waiting for emotional crumbs. They choose differently. They walk differently. They love differently. They see differently. They become different. This difference is what Jung described in his darker writings, the point where an individual becomes aligned with both their conscious and unconscious self. At this point, the empath becomes indivisible, unified, whole. This is the final stage. But here's the part no one expects when the empath reaches this stage. The world around them shifts instantly. People who once drained them lose access to their energy. People who once controlled them lose influence. People who once confused them become transparent. People who once felt magnetic lose their pull. Attraction flips. Power flips. Destiny flips. The empath becomes the center of their own life, not an accessory to someone else's narrative. Jung said it best: no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. And the empath has roots in hell. They've lived in emotional hell for years. They've carried storms in silence. They've held pain for others. They've grown through darkness. This is why their transformation is so profound, so rare, so dangerous. Because the empath does not rise lightly. They rise from the depths, from shadows, from wounds, from truths that others refuse to face. And the final stage of the empath, this dangerous awakening, is the moment they no longer apologize for their power. They embrace it. They embody it. They become it. And once they do, they cannot be broken again. This is only the beginning. What comes next is the unraveling of everything you thought you knew about yourself, your relationships, your purpose, and your destiny. Most people believe the empath's transformation is gentle, something soft, something peaceful, something that looks like meditation or healing retreats or whispered affirmations. But that is not how the psyche works. Not according to Jung, and not according to the truth buried inside every empath who has ever been pushed to their breaking point. Because the final stage doesn't begin with softness. It begins with rupture. A rupture so quiet that no one else notices it. A rupture so internal that even the empath doesn't fully understand what's happening. A rupture that feels like something inside you is cracking open, but not in a way that hurts. It feels like something that was asleep inside you finally stands up. This is the moment Jung described as the surfacing of the unconscious. A moment where the self that has been repressed, ignored, silenced, dismissed, finally pushes its way into the light. And here's what no one tells you: the empath's unconscious is not weak. It is not fragile. It is not delicate. It is ancient. It is intuitive. It is fiercely intelligent. It is spiritually attuned. It is connected to instincts the empath has spent their entire life suppressing. And once it rises, the empath changes forever. But before this rise becomes visible, there is a strange calm that appears. A calm that feels unnatural. A calm that feels like standing in the center of a storm but not being touched by it. A calm that feels like the emotional noise of the world has suddenly turned silent. Most people never realize what happens next. The empath begins to detach. Not from love. Not from humanity. Not from compassion. They detach from illusion. From emotional traps. From manipulative dynamics. From fantasy bonds. From psychological mirroring that kept them in chains. From the unconscious agreements that made them give more than they ever received. This detachment marks the true beginning of the final stage. Because it is here, in this quiet emotional distance, that the empath begins to observe instead of absorb. They start to see people for who they really are, not who they pretend to be. Not who they want them to be. Not who hope tried to paint them as. Clarity replaces yearning. Truth replaces fantasy. Sight replaces blindness. And this clarity is dangerous because it begins to dismantle every relationship the empath built while asleep. But here's the deeper twist: the empath is not detaching from people. They are detaching from the role they were forced to play. They are stepping out of the archetype of the giver, the healer, the fixer, the emotional container for others. They are stepping toward the self. Jung would say they are entering individuation, the process where the soul begins returning to itself, where the unconscious and conscious merge, where the true self awakens beneath the rubble of old identities. And once this process begins, there is no turning back. The empath feels a strange sensation in this stage, a mix of relief and grief. Relief because they finally feel themselves. Grief because they realize how much of themselves they abandoned just to survive. They grieve the years spent being too understanding, too forgiving, too patient, too selfless. They grieve the softness that was used against them, the intuition they silenced, the boundaries they never drew, the needs they buried, the dreams they postponed. This grief is sacred. It is the funeral of the old self, the burial of the version of you that was shaped by trauma rather than truth. But this grief does something extraordinary. It purifies you. It empties you. It cleans out the emotional residue of every person who fed on your gentleness. And after the grief comes rebirth. Rebirth is subtle at first. You notice it in the tiniest ways. A moment where you say, no, without guilt. A moment where you walk away without fear. A moment where you choose peace instead of saving someone. A moment where you no longer feel responsible for another person's storms. A moment where your silence feels stronger than your explanations. These moments accumulate. They gather like sparks inside your psyche. Until one day, they ignite. This ignition is the birth of the dangerous empath, the empath who has awakened to their power. Not loud power. Not aggressive power. Not vengeful power. Quiet power. Rooted power. Spiritual power. The power of a soul that knows itself. A soul that refuses to bend. Refuses to be drained. Refuses to be deceived by emotional performance. Refuses to be manipulated by guilt or obligation. Refuses to be trapped in cycles of unreciprocated care. The dangerous empath is not someone who harms. They are someone who cannot be harmed in the same way again. This is what makes them one of the chosen souls in Jung's language, individuals destined to walk a path of self-realization through suffering. But here's the part most people never expect. When an empath reaches the final stage, they begin to radiate something different, a new kind of emotional frequency, a calm intensity, a grounded presence, a silent confidence, a truth that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. People notice this, even if they don't understand it. Some are drawn to it, as if recognizing something sacred, something wise, something ancient. Others are threatened by it, because they can no longer control you. They can no longer guilt you. They can no longer manipulate your empathy. They can no longer shape your identity with their needs. The dangerous empath becomes untouchable to those who once fed on their softness. And this is where the story deepens. Because reaching the final stage doesn't just change your relationships. It rewires your entire perception of life. You begin to sense energies instantly. You feel the truth behind words. You see the intentions behind actions. You read emotional patterns like a second language. You anticipate shifts before they happen. You recognize masks the moment they appear. This sensitivity is no longer a curse. It is a compass. It guides you away from people who are not aligned. It pulls you toward those who are meant to walk with you. It helps you navigate life with a clarity that borders on spiritual intuition. Jung believed intuition was the highest form of intelligence, a merging of conscious reasoning and unconscious knowing. When the empath reaches the final stage, intuition becomes their native language. But here's the part that creates the most profound transformation: the empath stops needing closure. stops needing validation, stops needing approval, stops needing to explain themselves, stops needing to be understood, stops needing to fix anything that isn't theirs. This is the moment the empath becomes truly free. Freedom doesn't feel like joy at first. It feels like space. A vast internal space that was once crowded by other people's emotions. A quiet internal space that was once filled with noise. A sacred internal space that now belongs entirely to you. This space scares people because it means you are no longer emotionally available in the ways you once were. But this space empowers you because it means you are entering the final stage of your evolution. The final stage is not better boundaries. It is not saying no more often. It is not self-love affirmations. The final stage is sovereignty. Sovereignty is the moment your soul stops seeking external direction, stops bending backward for approval, stops dimming itself for comfort, stops carrying emotional burdens that don't belong to it. Sovereignty is the moment you realize I am enough as I am. My energy is sacred. My intuition is valid. My truth is non-negotiable. My worth does not depend on being useful. My empathy is a gift, not a leash. This sovereignty is what makes the empath so dangerous in the final stage. Not because they harm, but because they can no longer be harmed by the same patterns. The cycle ends with them. The generational wounds end with them. The emotional inheritance ends with them. The unconscious repetition ends with them. They become the breaker of psychological chains. And this breaking radiates outward into their entire life. Relationships shift. Attraction shift. Destiny shift. Identity shift. You start attracting people who match your healed energy, not your wounded energy. You feel drawn to environments that nourish your soul. You sense paths that were invisible before. You begin moving differently, speaking differently, choosing differently. And the most surprising transformation of all emerges: you start choosing yourself. Not as a reaction, not as rebellion, as alignment. This alignment opens doors that were once locked, connections that were once impossible, opportunities that once felt out of reach, clarity that once felt blurry, peace that once felt foreign. But here's the shadow twist that even the empath does not expect as you reach the final stage. You become someone the old version of you would not recognize: someone whole, someone strong, someone intuitive, someone awake, someone chosen. This is where the path begins to change shape, where the unconscious starts guiding you toward people who are meant for the awakened version of you, toward experiences that match your new emotional frequency, toward a destiny that was never accessible while you were asleep. The dangerous empath is not a villain. They are not heartless. They are not cold. They are simply aligned. And alignment is the most powerful form of transformation Jung ever described. This is only the second phase of your awakening. What comes next is deeper, darker, more revealing, more liberating. And it will change everything you think you know about the empath's final evolution. There comes a moment in every awakened empath's journey that feels almost unreal. A moment where the world around them no longer matches the world inside them. A moment where people look the same, speak the same, act the same, and yet everything feels different. It's not the world that changed. It's you. Jung said that once the unconscious becomes conscious, you don't just see differently, you perceive differently. This perception is what marks the empath's passage into the third transformation. The transformation that turns sensitivity into insight, insight into intuition, intuition into foresight. This is the stage where the empath stops reacting and starts knowing. Knowing without evidence, knowing without explanation, knowing without doubt. It feels like a second sight, a hidden sense, a deeper intelligence rising from the depths of the psyche. Most people never realize what happens next. Because when the empath begins to truly know, they stop searching outside themselves for answers. They stop asking for clarity. They stop needing reassurance. They stop craving validation. They stop chasing closure. They stop explaining the feelings they've always had. And this self-trust changes everything. You begin to move with a kind of quiet certainty that makes people pause. A certainty that cannot be faked. A certainty that cannot be shaken. A certainty that feels dangerous to those who once relied on your doubt. Because people who benefited from your confusion fear your clarity. People who depended on your softness fear your boundaries. People who relied on your silence fear your voice. People who used your empathy fear your awakening. And when you finally step into this knowing, you realize something profound. Your empathy was never the weakness. Your lack of boundaries was. And as this truth settles in your bones, something begins to shift inside you, an internal rearranging, a psychic rebalancing, a spiritual realignment. This realignment draws a line between who you were and who you are becoming. You can feel it, a subtle pressure, a quiet tension, a sense that you are being pulled away from the old self and toward the self that has been waiting beneath the surface. This is the threshold of the dangerous empath, the moment you become aware of your power rather than afraid of it. But power does not come without consequences. Your energy begins to speak for you. It enters the room before you do. It draws attention without trying. It disrupts patterns without effort. It exposes false intentions without confrontation. And you begin to notice reactions. Some people feel drawn to your presence, not because you are soft, but because you are real. Because you carry a truth that resonates with something buried inside them. Others, however, pull away. They distance themselves. They become uncomfortable, restless, defensive, cold, not because you changed, but because they cannot hide in your presence anymore. The empath at this stage becomes a mirror, a deep mirror. A mirror that reflects not what a person wants to see, but what they are. This mirror makes you dangerous to the unconscious, not because you harm, but because you reveal. And people fear being revealed. But here's where the story turns. Because as this mirror grows clearer, the empath begins to face their own reflection too. Not the wounded reflection, not the abandoned reflection, not the guilt-shaped reflection, not the overly responsible reflection. The true reflection, the self that is whole, the self that is grounded, the self that is no longer defined by suffering, the self that no longer needs to be the healer, the self that no longer bends under the weight of old roles. This reflection is startling. It feels unfamiliar, yet deeply familiar, as if you are meeting the part of you that was always waiting behind the curtain. Your shadow, your strength, your sovereignty. And as you meet this version of yourself, you realize something life-shifting. You were never meant to live your life as the emotional anchor for others. You were meant to live your life as an aligned soul. That alignment begins drawing new experiences to you. New people, new synchronicities, new opportunities, new paths that were invisible when you were drowning in emotional noise. This is where the third stage begins to deepen, the stage of true differentiation. Differentiation is not detachment. It is distinction. The recognition that you are you, and another person is themselves separate, accountable, responsible for their own psyche. For empaths, this realization is seismic, a tectonic shift in the psyche, because for most of their lives, they felt responsible for everyone's emotional temperature, responsible for repairing everything broken, responsible for fixing what wasn't theirs, responsible for soothing storms they did not create. But now you stand on different ground. You realize their feelings are not my burden. Their chaos is not my duty. Their healing is not my obligation. Their storm is not my sanctuary. This recognition marks a profound milestone in individuation. The empath becomes emotionally autonomous. And emotional autonomy is powerful. It is freeing. It is clarifying. It is stabilizing. But it is also intimidating to others, especially to those who relied on your emotional availability as a guarantee. They feel the shift. They feel the loss of access. They feel the distance. They feel the sovereignty. They sense you waking up. And waking up is the most dangerous thing an empath can do. Because an awakened empath is no longer predictable, no longer susceptible, no longer easily guilted, no longer easily manipulated, no longer easily confused, no longer emotionally enslaved by someone else's needs. And here's where the next shadow twist arrives. As you evolve, you begin to sense the motives behind people's actions, often before they even realize them themselves. Their body language reveals truth. Their micro-expressions reveal fear. Their tone reveals insecurity. Their inconsistencies reveal lies. Their patterns reveal unconscious shadows. This insight is not learned. It is awakened. It was always there, buried under years of emotional labor. Silenced by self-doubt. Muted by people who feared your clarity. But now it rises like a second consciousness. A quiet whisper. A subtle knowing. A voice inside you that says, something is off. They aren't being honest. This connection is not aligned. This path is not yours. Step back, and you listen. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. This listening is what turns the empath into a force. A presence. A soul with discernment sharper than intuition alone. You begin to choose differently. You begin to walk differently. You begin to speak differently. You begin to trust differently. You begin to live as if you were always meant to be the chosen version of yourself, the version that survived, the version that awakened, the version that stands intact. But here's the deepest shift of all: you begin to feel your own energy, not the energy of others, not the storm of the room, not the emotional pressure of those who need you. Your energy. At first, it feels foreign. Then it feels grounding. Then it feels like home. This feeling becomes the foundation of the final stage. Because once an empath feels their own energy, they stop leaking it. And when they stop leaking it, everything changes. Your presence grows dense, magnetic, silent but powerful. People can feel it when you walk into a room. They can sense the shift without you speaking. Your energy becomes your boundary, impenetrable, unwavering, unmistakable. This density is what makes the final stage so transformative. The empath no longer floats emotionally. They root. They anchor within themselves. They become a psychological mountain, unmovable by the winds of others' emotions. This mountain-like presence is not hardness. It is solidity. It is the return of your essence. It is the moment you realize, I do not need to be needed to be valuable. This truth destroys the old scripts, the unconscious contracts, the emotional debris, the wounded roles you inherited. You step out of every version of yourself that was shaped by survival. You step into the version shaped by consciousness. And once you step into this consciousness, you notice something astonishing: you no longer feel alone. Not because someone entered your life, but because you entered your own life. You feel accompanied by your intuition. You feel guided by your soul. You feel held by your inner truth. You feel seen by the self you discovered through shadow. This internal companionship is rare, sacred. Jung called it the marriage of the psyche, the union of the conscious and unconscious. Most people never experience this union, but those who do become their own source of power. This is the point where the empath begins radiating an inner stability that feels almost supernatural. And this radiance attracts something new: not people, not validation, not admiration, alignment, aligned experiences, aligned relationships, aligned opportunities, aligned paths. Paths that were invisible before now open like doors. People who were once strangers now feel like mirrors. Moments that once felt random now feel synchronistic. Life begins to unfold in ways that feel intentional, crafted, designed by the deeper intelligence within you. But here's the haunting twist as the empath rises into alignment. The old world begins to fall away. Not because you reject it, but because you outgrow it. You outgrow the dynamics that drained you. You outgrow the people who misused your heart. You outgrow the spaces that silenced you. You outgrow the identities that shrank you. You outgrow the patterns that wounded you. This outgrowing is not a loss. It is liberation. And liberation marks the emergence of the final stage, a stage the empath cannot enter without shedding the old skin. The shedding comes with sorrow, but the awakening comes with light. Not external light, inner light. A light that feels earned. A light that feels ancient. A light that feels like it was always inside you, waiting for the moment you were ready. And now, you are ready. The final stage is approaching. Quietly, gradually, inevitably. But the final stage is not just about who you become. It is about what your presence does to the world around you, to the people you meet, to the relationships you form, to the destiny that begins unfolding before you. There is still one more transformation left, one more truth, one more awakening that will complete the empath's dangerous evolution. And that truth will change everything. There is a moment in the empath's evolution that feels like stepping across an invisible threshold. A moment where something shifts so profoundly inside you that you cannot explain it, cannot reduce it to language, cannot shape it into a simple idea. It is the moment where every internal fragment you've been collecting through awakening, through grief, through clarity, through shadow, finally comes together, not as a recovery, not as healing, as identity. The empath becomes whole. This wholeness does not feel like relief. It does not feel like joy. It feels like returning to yourself after being gone for a very long time. At first, this return is disorienting. You look at your reactions and realize they are different. You look at your boundaries and realize they are firmer. You look at your relationships and realize they are clearer. You look at your energy and realize it is yours again, not pulled apart by the needs of others. This restoration is subtle but unmistakable. It feels like a steady pulse deep in the center of your being. A pulse you forgot existed. A pulse that says you are here now. You are whole now. You are free now. Most people never realize what happens next, because wholeness changes your emotional gravity. It pulls in different experiences. It repels different people. It shifts your entire psychological ecosystem. And it reveals the secret Jung understood, but rarely spoke plainly about once you become whole. The unconscious no longer controls your life. You control it. This is the most dangerous stage of all. Not because you become harmful, but because you become untouchable. No one can manipulate a sovereign empath. No one can destabilize an aligned soul. No one can twist the truth of someone who sees with both inner and outer sight. No one can extract energy from someone who knows how to root it. This is the moment the empath steps fully into the final stage, psychic integrity. Psychic integrity is not protection. It is embodiment. The full union of the conscious self and the shadow self. The merging of light and dark. The acceptance of every part of your emotional structure. It is the point where the empath becomes a complete psychological system. Not fragmented by guilt. Not divided by self-sacrifice. Not drained by emotional enmeshment. You become someone who cannot be split. Jung believed the greatest danger in the psyche is fragmentation, being torn apart from the inside by conflicting identities, conflicting roles, conflicting fears, conflicting expectations. The empath lived fragmented for most of their life, shaped by others, pulled by others, defined by others. needed by others. But now, you reshape yourself. And as you reshape yourself, the world reshapes around you. Your presence becomes sharper. Your intuition becomes louder. Your boundaries become instinct. Your silence becomes clarity. Your truth becomes non-negotiable. This is the stage where you feel less emotional reaction and more emotional awareness. You observe instead of absorb. You respond instead of react. You sense instead of suffer. You choose instead of chase. These differences create a new version of you, a version that moves through life with a calm intensity that others cannot ignore. Some will admire you. Some will resent you. Some will fear the power you didn't know you had. And some will attempt to return, not because they love you, but because they sense what you have become: aligned, centered, self-directed, and no longer dependent on their approval. This return always happens. It is almost predictable, because the moment you stop being accessible, you become magnetic. Not to the ones meant for you, but to the ones who once fed on your empathy. But now, you do not respond the same way. Something inside you is different. Something inside you recognizes the pattern immediately. Something inside you whispers, "This is not for me anymore. I've outgrown this dynamic. The person I was is gone." And with that silent realization, you walk away without guilt, not out of bitterness, out of alignment. This ability to walk away is what makes the empath so dangerous in the final stage. Because the final stage is not about winning. It is not about proving anything. It is not about revenge. It is not about power over others. It is about power over yourself. Inner sovereignty, inner stability, inner clarity. The three elements that create the awakened empath. But there is still one more shift, the shift that completes everything. The shift Jung knew intimately. The shift that creates individuation. It is the moment the empath realizes they were never meant to be normal. They were meant to be conscious. Consciousness is their gift. Consciousness is their curse. Consciousness is the path they were always being pushed toward. And once they arrive at consciousness, their life changes direction completely. You begin to see patterns in your past that now make sense. Pain that had purpose. People who were teachers. Wounds that were awakeners. Losses that were redirections. You begin to understand why your heart was so open. Why your soul felt so heavy. Why you kept giving more than you received. Why you tolerated what broke you. Why you loved without boundaries. Why you carried storms in silence. It wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Preparation for the final stage, the stage of conscious self-possession. In this stage, the empath becomes a keeper of truth, a reader of energy, a holder of boundaries, a guide for others, a mirror for the unconscious, a stabilizing force in chaotic dynamics, a magnet for aligned souls, and a closed door for those not meant to stay. This stage turns the empath from a wounded healer into a self-possessed healer, not someone who bleeds to help others, but someone who guides from strength. This strength is not arrogance. It is presence. A presence that feels ancient. A presence that feels earned. A presence that feels like it came from the deepest parts of the soul. And this presence activates something strange: synchronicity. Jung believed synchronicity was the psyche's way of communicating when the conscious and unconscious align. And in this final stage, synchronicities appear with startling regularity. Numbers repeating, dreams becoming messages, people appearing at the exact moment you need them, choices unfolding as if guided, paths revealing themselves without effort, truths rising with uncanny timing. This is the universe acknowledging your shift. This is your psyche becoming a single, unified organism. This is the empath becoming something new, something the world recognizes unconsciously. A chosen soul. Not chosen in ego, chosen in purpose. Chosen in psychological destiny. Chosen in inner awakening. And now, the final understanding arrives. The understanding that completes the entire transformation. The empath realizes that their suffering was not meaningless. Their wounds were not punishments. Their softness was not a flaw. Their depth was not a burden. Their sensitivity was not a curse. It was the initiation. The initiation that forged the final version of them, a version capable of deep love without losing themselves, of deep compassion without collapsing, of deep presence without absorbing, of deep intuition without self-doubt. This is the final stage of the empath, the dangerous healer, the one who carries both light and shadow, the one who feels deeply yet stands firmly, the one who heals without harming themselves, the one who sees the truth behind masks, the one who walks with clarity instead of fear. The world does not teach people how to handle this version of an empath, because this version is not here to be drained, not here to be diminished, not here to be misunderstood, not here to be used, not here to be sacrificed. This version is here to live, fully, unapologetically, consciously, powerfully. This version is here to fulfill the destiny that was waiting on the other side of their suffering. And now, that destiny is unfolding, quietly, naturally, inevitably. Because once an empath reaches the final stage, there is no going back. There is no shrinking. There is no forgetting. There is no losing themselves again. They have become someone whole, someone aligned, someone sovereign, someone complete. They have become someone the world rarely sees, someone the unconscious recognizes instantly, someone the soul has been preparing for years. They have become the final, awakened, dangerous empath, the archetype Jung never named, but always understood. Their shadow is integrated. Their light is anchored. Their heart is steady. Their mind is clear. Their soul is awake. And now, the journey continues in a way it never could before. Because this is not the end. This is the beginning of their true life, the life that was always meant to be lived once they became whole. Now, breathe. You already know what comes next. If this message found you at the right moment, subscribe for the next awakening.